So as it happened, um, in the week prior to the election, when the media was speculating that Bush might or Gore might win the Electoral College by winning large states by small margins, of course, it was the pro-Bush students who were denouncing the Electoral College, and the Gore supporters who were arguing that, well, it was really important that we preserve the role for the states in this election process. Well, after the election, um, all my students switched their positions from the previous week. The Bush supporters were now supporting the Electoral College and saying how important it was that voters in small states have their preferences protected in the Electoral College. And the Gore supporters denouncing the Electoral College as a travesty and a violation of democracy. And of course, it was surprising to me that to a person, they had all flipped their stances. But it was even more surprising to me that they would make these arguments so vigorously when presumably they remembered what they said the week before, and they remembered that they had said it to me the week before, and that I would remember what they had said the week before and would see how strategically partisan they were in their arguments. So on the Electoral College, as in many other process type issues, I've always been skeptical that people have very firm opinions on them that go any further than will it produce the outcome that my partisan inclinations prefer. So I want to briefly go back and look at what the founders were up to when they proposed this thing, and to see how it is really, or how the changes in our political process over time make the founders' intention with the Electoral College kind of a misfit with our contemporary political environment. So in the 2000 case, Bush versus Gore, the fact that the popular vote and the Electoral College vote did not produce the same outcome would be totally fine with the founders. In fact, they created the Electoral College with the explicit intention of having the Electoral College be independent of public opinion. If you read the Federalist Papers, you see a lot of their discussion of the history of democracies and why they'd all failed. And from the founders' perspective, previous democracies had failed because the average voter they thought was too self-interested. And politicians would know that and would manipulate voters by appealing to those voters' self-interest. So the founders wanted an electoral college rather than a direct vote in order to create distance between, they thought, a manipulable public, a self-interested public, and choosing the president of the United States. Second reason why the founders would have been okay with the 2000 result was because of federalism. They specifically wanted states to matter. They awarded electoral college votes to the states based on the state's representation in Congress, the number of members the state had in the House, which was of course based on population, plus their two senators. So again, there was some weight for the fact that states mattered, not just based on population. However, there are two key differences in how 2000 played out and the way the founders wanted the Electoral College to work. First, and probably most importantly, the founders did not want political parties. The founders thought that parties would put the party's short-term self-interest above the national interest. And so the fact that today electoral college votes are allocated based on the winner of the political party in the state would not be what the founders desired whatsoever. Likewise, the founders would not have wanted our current winner-take-all system. They wanted electors, as I'll talk about in a minute, to behave independently, evaluate the candidates, not vote based on the popular opinion in their state, let alone on the political parties in their state. Okay, so what did the founders want? Why did they create this electoral college? Well, the goal of the Constitution is to disperse power. The founders didn't want tyranny. And of course, we were coming out of the Revolutionary War where Prince George was, or King George was a tyrant. The Parliament abetted that. We didn't have representation. So, and the founders defined tyranny not just as a dictator, but the concentration of power in any single set of hands. So their goal was to disperse power in multiple ways, through checks and balances, through separation of powers, through federalism, and through an electoral system where each office at the federal level was elected in a different way. House of Representatives by the people, Senate by the state legislatures, President by this mix of, well, this convoluted system that I'll describe in a minute. The judiciary nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and so on. So in many ways, the Electoral College is this complex creation that really exemplifies this broader logic of the Constitution in dividing power in multiple ways. So the Electoral College was supposed to work in a way that would create separation between a public that the founders distrusted and the presidency by creating essentially two stages of review by political elites. The first stage was local elite. And the key to understanding this is understanding who the founders thought the electors would be, the participants in the Electoral College who would choose the president. Founders did not want political parties. They did not want candidates campaigning for office. Again, they thought candidates would be manipulative. So they wanted local people to select elite to be electors, local people who local voters had experience with, mayors, city council people, state representatives, perhaps former members of Congress, that voters would vote for people they trusted to be in a good position to evaluate who would be a good president. So these would be people with political experience, perhaps people who would know what it took to govern effectively, perhaps people who would know candidates who they thought would be good for president, so would know of their personal characteristics, their background, their virtues, their governing accomplishments. The founders put particular attention to a concept they call virtue. Today, when we use the word virtue, we think of personal morality. That's not exactly the way the founders used it. They used virtue to mean the ability to put the public interest ahead of your own self-interest. Okay, so the challenge for us today in evaluating character or virtue, either in a narrow moral sense or in the founder sense of serving the public interest, is that we as voters don't really know the candidates very well. We see them on their self-serving campaign commercials. We see them through the media, but we don't have a very good ability to judge their own character, particularly since all they're doing is throwing food at one another, and the character of both candidates looks pretty sketchy. Okay, but if you have people with political experience who have perhaps served in Congress with the major candidates that are being considered, you don't have to rely on what the media says about them. You don't have to rely on what they say about themselves. You don't have to rely on campaign advertising. You know them. You have the ability to judge what their accomplishments are, their governing ability, their ability to put the public interest ahead of their own self-interest. Okay, so these local elite would be elected by local voters. They would get together in the state capitol after the presidential election. They would nominate the candidates. The electors would nominate the candidates. So again, no political parties, so we don't have primaries, we don't have caucuses, we don't have political conventions. The Electoral College would nominate the candidates in the state capitol, okay? So if I'm an elector, I stand up and say, I think George Washington would be the best president, and I think you should vote for him for X, Y, and Z reasons, okay? And somebody else could stand up and nominate Thomas Jefferson and say, you should vote for Jefferson because of his accomplishments. Okay, and everybody could nominate the different candidate if they wanted, and we'd lay out the merits of the candidate we nominated, and we'd attempt to persuade one another. Okay, we'd attempt to build a consensus behind our candidate, and if other electors agreed with us, they could vote our way. But if they weren't persuaded, they could stick with their original candidate. And North Carolina has 15 electoral college votes. Each of those electors could vote 15 different ways for 15 different candidates. And that was fine. Okay, so the first stage of review is these local elites. Okay, if no candidate got a majority of the electoral college, then we get our second stage of elite review. The top 3 candidates, in terms of votes they got from these local elites in the states, would go to Congress, and Congress would choose from the top 3 candidates in terms of electoral college votes. And we have 1 vote per state. So Virginia counts the same as Pennsylvania, the same as Rhode Island. Each state gets 1 vote. Congress chooses from the top 3. Okay, and then the Senate, again, 1 vote per state, would choose the vice president. Okay, so you'd have the local elite essentially nominate the candidates, and then the national elite, Congress, would make the final decision. Okay, so that would, in the founders' view, allow the people input. The people would choose the electors, choose the people they trusted to nominate the candidates, and then experienced people who would know the main candidates would be the ones who would make the final selection. So that may sound good in theory. It worked a total of 2 times. When George Washington was the candidate and everybody knew he was going to be the president. Thereafter, we shifted to a system where the political parties nominated the candidates, and electors would basically stick with their political party. So it's worked somewhat similarly to the way it does now for most of our history. So whatever the merits of the founders' original vision, it proved to be perhaps too idealistic if it never actually worked in practice in a real competitive election. So I think one of the key issues I have today with the Electoral College is the skew or the weighting that the system of allocating votes to the states has. Wyoming, for example, has enough population for half a congressional district. Okay, it has about 600,000 people. Well, you can't have half a person in the House of Representatives. The Constitution guarantees you a full person. Likewise, the Constitution guarantees every state 2 senators, regardless of their population. So if you do the math, Wisconsin voters get a very heavy weight in the Electoral College compared to the number of voters there are. Okay, North Carolina has 15 Electoral College votes. We're a medium-sized state, so we have 13 members of the House plus our 2 senators. If you do the math, it takes about 3.6 voters in North Carolina to equal 1 vote in the Electoral College from Wyoming. Okay. In California, they're a very large state. They have 54 members of the House and still 2 senators. It takes about 4 votes in California to equal the same weight in the Electoral College as 1 of those votes from Wyoming. Okay? So I have no doubt that there are quite a number of virtuous people in Wyoming. I have a hard time thinking that they are 3.6 times more virtuous than you are, or that their vote should count 3.6 more times than your vote, or 4 times the weight of someone's in California. But because of the way we allocate Electoral College votes, they get a lot heavier weight than you do. Okay, so I don't think you should take my lesson today to be that you should move to Wyoming between now and the election so your vote counts 4 times as much as it does now, but it's an option. And that suggests a problem in the Electoral College, in that how much my vote counts should not depend on where I choose to live at any moment in time. So the second topic of my talk today is, well, your vote matters. And I hear this from voters around this time in presidential election frequently. Well, the Electoral College means my vote doesn't count, or my vote doesn't matter, therefore it doesn't matter if I vote or not. Okay, I chalk this one up to a sophisticated sounding way of saying, I'm not going to bother to vote. Okay, it sounds sophisticated because you're invoking this Electoral College, but of course your vote does matter. It does still count. The Electoral College, as I just said, does have a distorting effect on the vote, but it certainly doesn't mean your vote counts. Okay, and there are 4 ways your vote counts, regardless of how the Electoral College distorts it. First, your vote determines who wins your state's Electoral College votes. Okay, so it is a winner-take-all allocation of votes. It does mean that one candidate is going to get all 15, regardless of whether they got 51% or 60% of the vote in North Carolina. But essentially, that dynamic works the same as any other office in the United States. All our offices are basically winner-take-all. There's only one governor. There's only one senator elected at a time. There's only one member that represents your district in the House. The winner gets the office. The loser gets nothing. In all those races, just like in the Electoral College, your vote helps determine who wins that one prize. Just because you voted for the loser, your vote still counted. It's just your candidate didn't win. And that's disappointing, but that's the way we allocate offices. We don't get to share. Second reason your vote still counts, even if the Electoral College plays a role, is that there are other offices on the ballot besides the presidency. In fact, North Carolina has lots and lots and lots and lots of things on the ballot. We elect the Council of State, including such positions that most of us don't understand what they do, like Insurance Commissioner or Agriculture Commissioner, Secretary of State. We get to vote on them. We get to vote on the governor. We get to vote on County Commission, many seats on that. We get to vote for Soil and Water Conservation District representatives. And that's fun because they don't have political parties at all. So people don't know what they're doing for those offices. You get to vote on lots and lots of judges. Again, most people don't know who they're voting on there. And people like to say, well, what matters is, more to me is, what's going on at the local level, city council, county commission. What those offices have to do affects me a whole lot more than the presidency. And that's probably true. But if you're not voting because you're blaming it on the Electoral College, you're not affecting the offices that most people think affect them a whole lot more on a daily basis. Third, if you don't vote, someone else decides for you. Someone else is still going to win the office. All it means is they win without your ability to contribute to that outcome. Fourth, I often hear, if you don't vote, don't complain. Well, I don't actually agree with that, although I agree with the intention behind it. It's wrong because we still have the First Amendment right of free speech. You can complain as much as you want, regardless of whether you voted or not. But I'm not sure why you think anyone will take you seriously if you haven't voted. Politicians know very well the demographics of people who vote and who don't vote. And they are more likely to be responsive to people who they know show up to vote than people who they know don't show up to vote. And I think our coronavirus pandemic is a very good illustration of this. The people who are getting hit heaviest by this tend to be people like farm workers and meat packing workers. Not a whole lot of concern about their safety and sending them back to work. We're concerned about other things. So it's not necessarily their fault that they're poor and they don't vote. Many of them are not citizens, so they're not permitted to vote. Nevertheless, there's not a whole lot of incentive for politicians to be responsive to their immediate needs in the same way that they do to higher educated, higher income people such as me who can work from home and vote and set our priorities for the politicians. So there's a saying in politics: if you don't have a seat at the table, you'll be the lunch. If you don't have a seat at the table, you will be lunch. Okay, so if you're not showing up to vote, that means the people who are voting get to make the decisions that affect you, and they're probably going to protect themselves at your expense. Okay, so all other methods of creating social and political change are much harder than showing up to vote. You can make change by writing, calling, protesting, doing other things, and those are all effective, but electing someone who already agrees with you is going to make that change a whole lot more efficiently and effectively than using all those other much more indirect methods of influencing the political process. So when crazy Uncle Louis shows up at Thanksgiving dinner and says he didn't vote because of the Electoral College, you can tell him I told him he was wrong. I know it's actually you that mean it, but it's easier to blame it on me than blame it on you, because I don't have to put up with crazy Uncle Larry during Thanksgiving dinner. I'm happy to entertain any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heberlig. We are at 12:30. If folks do have questions, feel free to email them to either Jen or myself, and we can field them or forward them on. For those of you who do have to leave, we understand. And quickly before we do sort of close out and maybe get a couple of questions in, if Dr. Heberlig has some time to stay with us for a little bit longer. Next week, our topic is, what does this office actually do? So it's very good that you mentioned that a lot of times we don't understand the local offices that we are voting for. So Dr. Mary Jo Gowan-Shepherd of UNCC will be joining us to explain what role those local offices play in our lives and what those elected officials actually do for us. So we hope to see you on Thursday at Engage Her, and next Tuesday for the continuation of this Lunch and Learn series. Dr. Heberlig, that was awesome.
Thank you.
That was a great kind of in-depth spark notes, if that makes sense. A kind of a version of a very complicated system. So I really enjoyed it. I'm a political science major myself, so it was nice to hear it again and have it be so clear and concise.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask before I close out the meeting? Well, then I think you rocked it. Thank you so much, and thanks for hanging through those technology issues. We really appreciate you.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
All right, guys, have
Thanks
a great
so much.
day.